Okay, we're gonna get LinkedIn Live started when we can, but we're gonna go ahead and get started for all of those who were able to join us in the Zoom room today. Thank you so much for making time. This was kind of a last minute thing where we thought, oh my gosh, and I'm sure some of you were wondering, everybody else has done some kind of post-election session except for AmCham. So it's like, did AmCham fall asleep and didn't realize that the United States of America got a new-ish president coming in 2025 or what? And the reason is that we wanted to bring you something that was a bit different than what everyone else is doing. And so grateful to the Board of Governors who suggested, hey, why don't we invite some economists in? Because we're business leaders and we always listen to the economists, particularly ones like Dr. Taimur Baig at DBS. Yes, Taimur, you were named by our board as someone they wanted to hear from. And they thought the rest of the AmCham members would also enjoy hearing from you post-election. And so we've started this series, which is a continuation of season 1, America Through the Eyes of. So the next few sessions, we are going to have America Through the Eyes of Economists. And today we have Dr. Taimur Baig, who has always come to my rescue. So thank you so much, Taimur, for accepting the invitation to be first.
My pleasure, Hsien. Great to be here.
And I should mention to everyone, although you are so well known, that you do have a strong connection to the US, having gone to college and graduate school in the US. And then as you started to become more prominent of an economist, you moved through World Bank, IMF, Deutsche Bank, MAS here in Singapore, and then now finally at DBS. And you have just completed 143 episodes of Kopi Time, which is your widely known, well-acclaimed podcast that is both on Spotify and on iTunes. And so the team will put those links up for everyone so that you can continue to hear from Dr. Baig, Taimur, on his perspectives along with his guests. And for those of us who are not economists, sometimes it gets a bit cheem, which means very, very deep. But I certainly do learn a lot from hearing from Taimur on his podcast. So giving you 5 stars, yo, 5 stars. So let's go ahead and
appreciate that very much.
And everyone should listen to it, give you 5 stars. So we're gonna get started. My name is Hsien-Hsien Lei. I should have introduced myself at the beginning. I am the CEO of the American Chamber of Commerce, and I'm finishing up on 5 years sitting here in this seat, in this office. And because, you gotta shake things up a bit, in addition to having a new US president, a returning US president in January, we are also, as a chamber, demonstrating that we are ready to move forward into the future. We are currently expanding our office and doing a major renovation, which is why my office looks completely bare and boring today. But in March, we will be launching the new AmCham Singapore Member Hub. And so we are looking forward to opening that up and demonstrating how committed the American business community is to Singapore. So we're looking forward to introducing that. But meanwhile, we've got Dr. Taimur Baig, and I would love to ask you the first question. How it's gonna work is the first 30 minutes, we're gonna be on LinkedIn Live, and then we're gonna move into a closed door session where everyone who has joined us on Zoom will be able to have a closed door, more private conversation with you in that back half of the hour. So final 30 minutes will be a closed door conversation. But for now, you're stuck with me. And the first question I have for you is, tell us about your relationship with the United States.
Well, goes back more than 3 decades. I arrived in Crawfordsville, Indiana at the age of 18 to go to a small liberal arts college with 800 men. Yes, only men, called Wabash College. It's an old school. It was established in the 1830s. But, coming from Bangladesh, a busy, crowded city like Dhaka, to a town of 14,000, as my first small town experience, it was quite something. There were lots of tears, initially. And then I adapted to the Midwestern way of life where everybody says hi to each other when you walk down the street. And that is something that I have carried with me even today. Even in Singapore, I freak out people a lot when I make eye contact and say hi to them. And it goes back to my 18-year-old Indiana roots. I then stayed on the Midwest. After my undergrad, I went to do my PhD in Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, which is just about 80 miles away from Crawfordsville, but on the Illinois side. And I did my PhD in economics there. I met my today's wife, then girlfriend at that point there. And way back in 1999, right after getting a job offer, I looked at her and said, let's get married. and we got married in the Champaign Courthouse where Abraham Lincoln used to practice back in the days.
Oh, wow.
So my teen roots and my early 20s roots, my very formative years were spent in the Midwest. Then we moved to the East Coast. I worked at the IMF till 2008. I was in the Washington, D.C. headquarters of the IMF. My wife joined the World Bank at that time. So we were what is known in D.C. called the bank fund couple. But then we decided to come check out Asia, given that neither of us had ever worked in Asia. And we thought we'd do it for a couple of years. And 14, 16 years later, we're still here.
Oh, wow. So back in the day when you were both what did you call it? Bank fund couple.
Yes.
How did the future of the United States look to you? And, because you decided to leave and come to Asia. I mean, I have my own story behind that because my husband's Singaporean and he felt that there were more opportunities for Asians like us to contribute and be successful, being kind of a bridge back to the US in particular. Is that how you were thinking about it?
Well, a couple of things. The 90s when I went to school in the US was, as most of us who are on this call would recall, an era of tremendous optimism in the United States. It had post-Cold War. The US was the hegemon and at the same time was seen as an agent for good. And it was, relatively conflict-free. I mean, we had the issues in Bosnia, and the US did take a very active role in intervening in that. And later in the decade, we started seeing the brewing of terrorist attacks. But by and large, the 90s were tremendously um, optimistic and Pax Americana, if you will. I remember in 99 when I was in the job market, it sounds weird now, but I didn't have to look for jobs. Jobs came looking for me. The US economy was that hot, if you will, in terms of opportunities all over the country. The 2000s came with a bit of a rude awakening. Of course, September 11 happened, and then the very disproportionate response that the U.S. had in Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on. So by the time 2007, 2008 came along, especially with Bush 2.0 already taking place, I was not as much in love with the U.S. as I was in the 90s, if you will. And I think that it was time to take a break. And just being away for a couple of years would have been good, although my timing was terrible because just as I were getting ready to leave the US, Obama got elected, which again brought a lot of
Mhm.
optimism. And then I have a bunch of really bright young nieces and nephews who were just finishing college at that time, and they were starting to join the US administration. So we moved away from the US with very strong ties back in the US. But then the reason we stayed on longer in Singapore is more to do with Singapore than the US. The pull factors in Singapore, the comfort, the safety, security, and also the easy connectivity with the US makes it very easy for somebody who has even spent half their lives in the US to live in Singapore without necessarily feeling that they have forsaken the States. So that's how we felt. In fact, while living in Singapore, we ended up adding to our property exposure to the US by one more property in the later years. So that's, I think, the story. I wouldn't necessarily say that there were a bunch of things that were happening in the US that's pushed me out. It's really like Asia's opportunity, Asia's comfort, the excitement of Asia that sort of pulled us into this part of the world.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. And I suppose I should say the same, right? It was the pull of Asia. But I have to say, when you say you left the US right when President Barack Obama was elected, and I missed all of that. I left the US in 98. I have not lived full time in the US for a super long time. When you look back at the previous administrations, and because this is a post-election roundup kind of thing, it's like, oh, okay, we're about to move into a new era, so to speak. I'm not trying to quote Taylor Swift, guys, calm down. Um, but you've seen a bunch of presidents come and go from the vantage point of Asia, but with strong connections to the US. Tell us about how you felt as each administration changed, particularly as an economist, and then looking ahead, of course, to the returning President Trump.
It's interesting you say that. You're right. Sort of went to Clinton rallies when I was like 20 years old, stood in line in a hot San Jose afternoon for 2.5 hours to see him. And he was so young and so exciting. And Al Gore was by his side. And then he got elected. And then, the entire 90s were basically defined as the Clinton presidency. I remember very clearly him saying to the speaker in a joint house speech that, Mr. Speaker, the era of big government is over, which was a big switch for the Democrats. And of course, that led to years of fiscal consolidation and responsibility in the U.S. Rates came down, and in fact, I remember when Clinton was getting done and Gore was running as a successor, the question was, if the US government doesn't have any debt, how will we even have benchmarks interest rates in the US because there'll be no treasuries to price off of? Think how far we have come since then. We're talking about, tens of trillions of dollars worth of debt. But in
Oh
this
my
century,
God.
not like too long ago, in 2000, the question was what would happen if the US runs out of any debt to service? I think the biggest takeaway from me in those days, and this is something that's only begun to crystallize for me in hindsight, is how absent Asia was in the discourse. In 1997, 1998, there was a big financial crisis in Asia. I was a summer intern at the IMF in 98 summer, and the IMF is a multilateral organization. Of course, it looks at the whole world. And the Asian crisis was the center of the discourse in Washington in the multilateral world. But the moment I would step outside my IMF bubble and talk to regular Americans, they didn't know anything that was happening in Asia. The fact that in Korea, that mothers were mortgaging their rings to support the central bank, or that in a place like Thailand or Indonesia, there was tremendous social instability around the financial crisis. It was absent. People sort of thought of Europe. People thought of the U.S. exposure to, the former Soviet Union, how the NATO would expand. Those things were discussed even among the quote unquote enlightened circle. Asia was just an afterthought. Through the 2000s, focus went entirely toward the Middle East, Iraq, Afghanistan, and that sort of stuff. It's only in the last 10 years or so I've seen Asia sort of enter the consciousness of day-to-day Americans. Unfortunately, Shin, it is mostly about China and the negative narrative around that, as opposed to the Asia that you and I know and love so much, which is the opportunity, the excitement, the engine of growth.
Yeah, that's an important point. I think, first of all, confession, even as an Asian American, when I first met my husband, who said he was from Singapore, we were undergrads in college, early 90s, yeah. And he said he's from Singapore, and all of us, many of whom were Asian American, looked at him like, where's Singapore? And you get the usual, is it in China? The second one is, oh, it's tropical, so grass huts, or, had no idea it was a metropolis. So definitely Asia has come up in America's consciousness. But still, I mean, when I think about, you can go to Washington, D.C., the conversations about Ukraine and Gaza, which of course is incredibly important and disruptive, but this China conversation, how do we in Singapore and Southeast Asia continue to help Americans understand the contributions that this region makes to the global economy and the fact that we are not backwards, we are capable of doing world-class things across all sectors? How do we convince, especially corporate headquarters based in the US, how important this region is? Because you've seen in 2024 restructuring, reorgs that take out the regional layer from Southeast Asia, have people in Asia reporting once again to folks sitting in Europe. Like, what's the deal with that?
Right. So a week before the US election, so this was late October, I traveled through California, New York, and DC. And it was an remarkably interesting trip. So one was, the feedback I got from people about who they expected to win. We can talk about that later. But just in terms of Asia, you talk to people in San Francisco, or you talk to people in New York. So the people in San Francisco represent the tech sector. People in New York City represent the financial sector. They are fully engaged and aware about Asia's opportunities and potential. But then you come to DC, and you'd think that you'd be in a circle full of State Department people who have traveled the world. You'd be in a circle of diplomats, and therefore there's greater awareness of what's happening in the world. Shin is the opposite. There is no daylight between the Democrats and Republicans on this whole notion of how to deal with Asia, which is we have to beat up on China. That's it. You go to New York, you go to San Francisco, there are people who are about engagement, who are about opportunity, who are about the win-win narrative. In DC today, unfortunately, it is 100% a zero-sum narrative. It is China is winning, US is losing, we got to put up barriers, and then we will have to win so that China loses. There is no sense that somehow there could be an outcome which is good for both sides. And again, now the discussion about Asia is overwhelmed by China and the fears on China, which then translates into rather sort of, I would say, uninformed, very short-term oriented decision making about Southeast Asia and North Asia. And I think that is what you are alluding to, that when you hear large companies saying, we need to streamline our presence in Asia, I think what they're trying to say or do is change their strategy on China. But somehow in the noise of the corporate boardroom, everything gets cast under one big Asia umbrella, which I think is very, very unhelpful.
So creating this narrative for the corporate boardroom, what is the best way for businesses to help their board members and exco understand the level of investment that's needed in this region, particularly when we've also got a lot of worries around tariffs and how much of our business should we be moving back to the US? How much do we then do the whole China for China thing? I mean, there's all these different strategies that people are proposing. I'm not sure if anyone really understands what's going to happen in January 2025. That's next month, by the way, in case anybody forgot.
There are decent amounts of data out there that can help facilitate this conversation. It doesn't have to be a set of assertions, or it doesn't have to be a plea for refocusing on Asia. I think there's enough cold data out there to convince any neutral observer about the importance of remaining engaged with Asia. So let's put aside the obvious fact, which is there are many American companies which see 15 to 25% of their global revenues come from Asia. A lot of it from China, but also a substantial amount from Asia ex-China. And therefore, if you want to hold on to that revenue and don't want your balance sheet to shrink, you should remain engaged, and you should try to find strategies of remaining what we call long Asian consumers, long Asian purchasing power. The second is this realignment of the supply chain. The COVID pandemic, in my view, is the much bigger driver of the realignment discussion than even the Trump tariff war was. There is this genuine desire, even among the companies which recognize the importance of Asia, that having your supply chain entirely built in that part of the world, when one global shock can really sever that, I think it is a wise one, and therefore some degree of so-called friendshoring, nearshoring, in my view, makes sense. Look, if you go to Mexico today, there are 1,100 Chinese companies which are helping that nearshoring narrative. So it's not, again, a zero-sum story. It could be nudging some Asian companies saying that you should have certain footprints, a supply chain beyond what we have to make our own supply chain or our own product inflows more resilient. So to me, that's one way of looking at it. Stay long Asian demand, and work with Asian companies and use their know-how to reduce some of your supply chain risk, which has been so jarring, 5 years ago during the pandemic. But beyond that, Hsien, you may know that Bain and Consulting and we cooperated and collaborated on a report earlier this year called Southeast Asia 2024-34. And one of the key messages in that article is that this region, Southeast Asia in particular, has tremendous tailwind of investment around that China plus one realignment of supply chain narrative. And amazing amount of investment is coming into the region from the US, from Europe, from India, and from North Asia in sort of reigniting the dynamism of the region's supply chain on electronics, on green energy transition, and so on. A very quick side data point, Malaysia 5 years ago was receiving, in terms of investments into its information, communications, and technology sector, $0. Really, if you go to Malaysia's balance of payments, you'll see 2018 and 2019 ICT investments from overseas investors is zero. Last year, it was 80 billion ringgit, 20 billion US. So it's gone from 0 to 20 billion US in the span of 5 years. So that kind of tells you the kind of scaling up of investment that's happening in the region. And to me, just that number alone should capture the imagination of boardrooms in the West.
That is a really important point, as most of the folks who are on this Zoom with us know. Singapore is a regional and international hub. So many of the companies that are based here are not just servicing Singapore, they're servicing the whole region. And that has, raised some questions about how best to operate within, say, Southeast Asia or Greater Asia Pacific. And many of the business leaders I speak to are struggling as well because they also have to think about China. So for these regional operations, and thinking about how to leverage ASEAN/Southeast Asia, which is not the same thing, by the way, folks. And then the other piece, which for many of them, they have to think about China or Greater China, and then Middle East. How would you advise senior business leaders as they're running their regional operations? I mean, do they compartmentalize in their head how all this works? Do they leverage a piece of it to benefit another region? How's that work for them, do you think?
They should not, absolutely should not compartmentalize. There is tremendous interlinkage between the Middle East and South Asia and Southeast Asia. And all of those linkages also manifest into substantial linkages with Europe and the US. The world is connected, despite all the stories of what we call geoeconomic fragmentation over the last decade or so between the tariff war and the tech war. The fact of the matter is the world trades more today than it did 5 years ago, and 5 years ago the world was trading more than it did the previous 5 years. So the US is actually running a bigger trade deficit today than it did in Trump 1.0, or even before Trump 1.0, simply because the US is importing less from China. Doesn't mean US is importing less, it's just importing less from China and more from the rest of the world. So the rest of the world remains interconnected. There is a lot of symbiosis between, say, of manufacturing plant in Singapore and the suppliers in Taiwan. There is a lot of symbiosis between chip wafer manufacturer in Singapore and the actual chip fabricator in Taiwan. So it goes both ways. Similarly, if you think about a country like India, which in recent years has had its issues with China, trade deficit vis-a-vis China is substantial and widening because India, in its desire to industrialize, is recognizing by the day that being part of the Chinese manufacturing supply chain, being part of the Southeast Asian manufacturing supply chain is a prerequisite to its ambition of becoming a manufacturing powerhouse. Similarly, if you go to the Middle East, they are very comfortable selling their commodities to China, receiving payments these days in RMB as opposed to the US dollar, and then engaging with banks in Southeast Asia like DBS in managing that RMB risk. So when I travel to Dubai or Abu Dhabi, I'm not compartmentalizing my worldview. I'm actually bringing on board views about the back and forth of flows from that region to our region. Similarly, when I'm in the US, I'm not just talking about market share of US companies in Southeast Asia. We talk about market share of US companies in everywhere in the world and how those market share are fed by this dynamic supply chain that primarily reside in Southeast Asia, but extend beyond that.
Mm. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about startups, because where we sit, I think there's a concerted effort to create a vibrant ecosystem to support startups. And the conversation when it comes to VCs and startups is, when are you going to go and access the US market? When are you going to go beyond Singapore/Southeast Asia in order to really see revenue and profit? I don't know if I really buy into the whole go to the US, that's where the money's at, that's where capital is. What is your take when it comes to startups and to some extent small and medium-sized enterprises?
I think looking at the journey of tech startups in Asia or Southeast Asia over the last decade, clearly the mantra for the really ambitious entrepreneur is I do something in Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, wherever. If it scales, if it catches the attention, hopefully somebody from Andreessen Horowitz or Peter Thiel's group or Omadi or somebody from the West Coast would give us a call and give us lots of money so that we can scale up and become even bigger, maybe in Asia, but hopefully the holy grail, the US, because it is a very large consumer market. And then the ultimate dream is to list at NASDAQ. So let's be clear. I think this is not something just a sort of Southeast Asian dream. I think that's the dream of every single big entrepreneur or entrepreneur with big dreams in the world that get recognized by US capitalists and US capital markets and the ultimate holy grail getting listed in NASDAQ. I think that tells you that intrinsic linkage between the big dreams of entrepreneurs around the world and the big dreams that are fed by American capital. I think that's a very powerful nexus, and we shouldn't push that away. Having said that, there is a deep capital market in this part of the world. You don't have to list at NASDAQ to reach unicorn status. In a country like Indonesia, in a country like Vietnam, you can reach unicorn status just by tapping the domestic demand market and local capital. So I think that I sort of absolutely encourage entrepreneurs to dream big and dream of one day getting listed in NASDAQ, but I don't want them to postpone that ambition just because that NASDAQ route is not materializing anytime soon. There's enough happening in the region. There's enough capital, private capital and public capital in the region, which can feed the most audacious entrepreneurs' dreams. So in recent years, from C to Grab, we've seen, I think, what is, in my view, is the first wave of companies that have captured Western capitalists' imagination, and they have done well in scaling up. But I think the next generation of startups in Southeast Asia will see a lot of interest from Chinese capital, and they would have to sort of decide whether that creates problems for them in terms of tapping Western markets. But if they can skirt that balance, I think they'll do very, very well. So for me, the coming decade, so let's say from 2024 to 2034, would be one characterized by regional investors and Chinese investors looking for opportunities in Southeast Asia. They will compete with Western capitalists, and that's a great thing for startups around the region.
I agree. I think that's a great opportunity. There certainly is a lot of money floating around our region that our startups could sure use. Before we transition off of LinkedIn Live, so we can have a private conversation with those who've logged into Zoom, and it's still not too late to register so that you can join in on the private conversation. But I'm going to ask one. You got to ask it. I just have to ask it, right? So President-elect Trump has been in the news every single day, making announcements related to the economy, related to trade. I can't even summarize it all, and I'm terrible with names anyway, so I don't know all these people who he has already said he would nominate. So just generally speaking, of all of the plans that the president has announced that he's going to implement in 2025, what are the specific things we should be watching out for, and what is your opinion about whether they're going to happen or not, or what's the impact?
I think two important things to look for. So one is this whole issue of cost of living. So I know that people would think that, the first thing I would have said was tariffs, but they're interconnected. When I sort of traveled through the US in the past year or two, I mean, people talk bitterly about inflation. So, and I, as an economist, tell them, well, inflation is down, it's not up. But they don't understand the difference between what I see as inflation, which is 12-month change in prices, versus the actual rise in the price level over the last 20 for 36 months. So people's complaint has always been my grocery bills cost today 30-40% more than it did a few years ago. Not about this economist answer of is it 2% up on a year-on-year basis, so forget about the stuff before that. No, they really, really feel things are much more expensive today. So what can Trump, given all his promises, do to arrest cost of living? So I think one of the big promises in the Trump campaign has been to liberalize fossil fuel production. Oil prices are actually pretty low. They're not exactly high. So I'm not really sure how much that can help as far as the pocketbook of Americans is concerned. And at the same time, there's been some talk about scaling back some of the subsidies for the EV transition, which I again sort of worry whether that helps the cost of living or not, because that seems to be something that Trump wants to do to satisfy his fossil fuel lobby. But he also has a techno bro lobby, Musk and others, and they probably want him to extend the EV subsidy. So let's see how that works out. But by and large, when I think of cost of living, the one thing that I know doesn't help cost of living is big tax cuts. And the expectation is that although he has a very slim majority in Congress, Trump will push very hard to make some of the Trump era 1.0 Trump era tax cuts permanent, as well as add more tax benefits for those who earn tips, maybe a few other things as well. And I think the one thing that the US really needs, I mean, going back to my earlier description of the Clinton era, is to sort of start taking care of its own balance sheet. And the US government has really spent a lot of money in recent years. They should probably spend less. Kind of cutting lots and lots of taxes will not help. And how that helps the whole cost of living situation, I frankly don't know, and I worry about it. So issue number one is the biggest complaint during the election season was cost of living. I'm not entirely sure Trump has a lot of things up his sleeve that helps it, whereas I wonder whether some of his promised measures would hurt it. So that's issue one. Second is the issue of immigration. It's again, very sensitive issue. People are very emotive about it. I have first generation immigrant friends who sort of like what Trump has been saying about cracking down on immigration. I find that very jarring because you'd think the last people who'd be sympathetic about undocumented workers would be those who were pretty, skirting the thin line between documented and undocumented back in the days, and now they're reaping the fruits of being U.S. residents and U.S. citizens. But it seems like in some big cities, in particular, law and order / immigration have been conflated. I think that is actually not quite right, but it is, as they say, what it is. People believe that undocumented immigration and law and order are two issues that need to be resolved simultaneously. It'll create a lot of noise given the promises of rounding up on undocumented workers, and the sort of the social amplification of the noise, I think, would be quite problematic. So how Trump goes about doing that, I'm sort of keen to see. And by the way, even this immigration issue and cost of living are intertwined, as we all know. Huge amount of service sector in the US is nourished, fed by undocumented labor. the delivery economy, the services economy, even like, if you go to get a haircut or have your landscape done of your garden, good chances that a lot of those workers are in the undocumented part of this segment. So that could actually lead to a crunch in the labor supply, could actually be inflationary. So that's the other thing that I'm looking for.
Yeah, two incredibly important issues that even affect the rest of the world, which is a whole much bigger topic when it comes to, the flow of refugees around the world, all the things that are happening and make me really worried. I have to say, I'm not so optimistic about 2025. I think 2024 was pretty difficult on a number of fronts, and 25 is shaping up to look a bit concerning. Are you, on a scale of 0 to 10, or how concerned are you about 2025? I'm very short term right now, 10 being like very concerned.
Right. So we survived Trump 1.0, we'll survive Trump 2.0. So that's my typical message for people who are very worried about, what's coming. I say that, life will go on. Don't worry about it. Do your thing, your business, your economy, your market share, and don't worry about the meta narrative so much. I mean, reading the newspaper every single day is a surefire way of getting super depressed and worried. Look, there are lots of fires around the world, from the Middle East to Eastern Europe, and in our own backyard in the South China Sea, there are simmering fires, hopefully not outright conflagrations. And as much as Trump would like to say that it's all about America first, and he wants to worry about what's happening inside borders, like it or not, he would have to get involved in all of those areas. And how he manages to sort of strike a balance between his ego-driven foreign policy, which is all about, if you don't flatter him, he's not going to give you a deal, versus just being very pragmatic about, what is important for both U.S. and its allies. The U.S. does not operate in this world on its own. Its allies play a very important role. So America first has to include that part. It cannot be either or. It has to be all of the above. So I do think that there are genuine worries about 2025, especially on the external front, but also on the domestic front related to cost of living and immigration. It'll be a lot. There won't be a lot of time to play golf in Mar-a-Lago, I'm afraid.
Noted. I will not play so much golf at Mar-a-Lago next year. All right. So to transition us off of LinkedIn Live, I'm just going to ask you 3 quickie questions to kind of ease us, and so we can smooth the way over to our closed door session on Zoom. The first question is, what's your favorite American food?
Tater tots and Tex-Mex.
The tater tots thing makes sense. Do you have a recipe that you can share later on it? What is that dish called? The tater tot dish, the melt thing. You have a recipe?
You mean just putting lots of cheese on top? Yes.
Okay, all right,
Yes.
cool. All right, that's noted. That's how you do your tater tots. The second question is, what is your favorite, which one of the cities, what's your favorite American city?
Look, I spent most of my time in the East and the West Coast of my life, but given that I went to school in the Midwest, I have to say I love Chicago. Chicago is a microcosm of what America is and should be. Amazing immigrant neighborhoods, going to, like, areas where the people from Poland came 100 years ago and still have beautiful Polish bakeries, and an amazing Chinatown, and the most modern, jaw-dropping skyscrapers, which are not all modern in the sense that they were built recently. Some of them were built like 80 years ago, but they're skyscrapers. And they sort of capture America's industrial dream and the beauty of building a city by the lake. So no, Chicago is my #1 city.
Oh, it's so cool to hear you describe Chicago like that. Final one, which kind of trips some people up, is who's your favorite American?
I was going to say Bruce Springsteen, but no, I'm going to say Al Gore. I'll tell you why I'm saying Al Gore. 24 years ago, there was a very contested election in the U.S., and there were all these questions about counting the votes the right way in Florida. And at the last moment, just when the vote count was heading toward his way, his dreams of becoming the next president of the United States was basically shut down by the U.S. Supreme Court. In a landmark decision, the Supreme Court basically stopped the counting, and the election went to George Bush Jr. What did Al Gore do at that time? Did he ask people to storm the Capitol and assert his rights? No, he went on TV and he said something akin to, that unites us is more important than that divides us. I recall that statement with a great deal of passion, because I think that's a clarion call for democratic leaders around the world, that in this divisive era, remember that when you're reaching for the highest office, you're reaching for a people, not just one party. I think what Al Gore did that day saved the U.S. from significant domestic unrest risk, People don't give him enough credit for that. And also, not being the president of the United States is not the end of the world. He went on to do amazing work on climate change, won the Nobel Prize, has written amazing books, and he's, I think, the only U.S. president ever, or not president, who tried to be president ever, to win the Emmy, the Oscar, and that's pretty amazing as well. So no, Al Gore is my favorite American.
That is very interesting and a great way to round off our LinkedIn Live session. Thank you everyone for joining us on LinkedIn Live. And now team, take us to the closed door session.